On the 5th of April, 1964, in a rented house in Beverly Hills, a man's heart stopped beating at 2:45 in the morning. He was 38 years old. He was, by most reasonable measures, the funniest man alive. He had been married to his second wife for precisely 6 weeks. She was 21, Swedish, and asleep beside him when his body began to convulse. On the bedside table sat a small glass capsule recently cracked open. Amyl nitrite. He had inhaled it in pursuit of what he later described, with characteristic understatement, as the ultimate experience. What he got instead was 8 consecutive cardiac arrests over the following 3 hours. The paramedics arrived to find Britt Eklund on her knees beside him, screaming into the telephone receiver. They worked on his chest. They lost him. They brought him back. They lost him again. By dawn, the doctors had restarted his heart with direct manual compression, and the man who would become Inspector Clouseau, Dr. Strangelove, and Chauncey Gardner lay in a hospital bed, blinking at the ceiling with an expression that those present described as oddly serene. In the days that followed, he told journalists, calmly, almost cheerfully, as though recounting a mildly amusing anecdote, that he had seen a brilliant blue light, that a hand had reached out towards him, that a gentle voice had said, "It's not time yet." He told this story for the rest of his life, sometimes embellishing it, sometimes stripping it bare, but always with the same quiet certainty. He believed he had crossed over and come back with a purpose. Whether any of this truly occurred remains a matter of dispute. The scholar Gregory Shushan has questioned the details. The attending physicians noted only clinical death and resuscitation. What nobody questioned, because nobody knew, was the thing he did not tell the journalists. In the instant his heart ceased to function, he did not feel terror. He felt relief. For the first time in 38 years, he did not have to be anyone. That same month, April 1964, his face appeared on the cover of Playboy magazine, the first man ever to receive that distinction. In the photograph, he looked irresistible, sharp, knowing, effortlessly in command. In reality, the cardiologist had forbidden him from standing up without assistance. To understand who this man was, this man who felt relief at his own death, one must go back 38 years, to a small seaside town where a Jewish woman with an iron will carried an infant onto the stage of a music hall and spoke aloud the name of a dead child. His name was not originally Peter. He was born Richard Henry Sellers on the 8th of September, 1925, in Southsea, Portsmouth, to a family that had no fixed address and no intention of acquiring one. His mother, Peg, née Ray, came from a sprawling dynasty of Jewish vaudeville performers whose roots tangled back through generations of music hall acts, and if family legend was to be believed, all the way to the celebrated bare-knuckle boxer Daniel Mendoza. Whether that genealogical claim was strictly accurate mattered less than what it represented. The Rays were performers. They had always been performers. The stage was not a profession. It was a bloodline. His father, Bill Sellers, William, a Protestant, a quiet man who played the ukulele in pit orchestras and said very little in a household where saying very little was the only available strategy, had married into the Ray clan and been promptly absorbed by it, like a minor character in someone else's play. Bill loved his son. The surviving accounts agree on this, but Bill's love was a low murmur in a room dominated by Peg's orchestra, and Peg's love was an orchestra. It was vast, relentless, and deafening. The name Peter belonged to an older brother who had been stillborn. Peg chose to give the same name to her living son, and in doing so she established the founding principle of his existence. He was a replacement. Before he could focus his eyes or hold up his head, he had already been cast in his first role, standing in for someone who was not there. It was a role he would play in various forms for the rest of his life. When he was approximately 2 weeks old, some early accounts say 2 days, the discrepancy has never been resolved. His parents carried him onto the stage of the King's Theatre during a variety performance. There were, apparently, applause. He received his first round of public approval before he had learned to recognize a human face. One might call this an auspicious beginning. One might also call it a warning. The childhood that followed was no childhood at all, at least not in any conventional sense. The Sellers family, Peg, Bill, and little Peter, moved constantly, trailing from one music hall to another across the towns and cities of England. There was no permanent home. There was no school attended for longer than a few months at a stretch. There were no lasting friendships with other children, because other children required stability, and stability was the one thing Peg could not provide and did not value. What she provided instead was total, undivided, suffocating attention. She dressed the boy like a small prince. She took him backstage, where he sat among the performers and listened to every adult conversation, absorbing accents and inflections the way other children absorbed nursery rhymes. He could mimic the voice of a stage manager before he could read. He could reproduce the cadence of a Lancashire comedian before he understood what a joke was. The talent was innate. The obsession with using it was Peg's. She was not merely a devoted mother. She was a possessive one, and the distinction matters. When young Peter showed interest in playing with other children, Peg intervened. When as a teenager he received a letter from a girl in the neighborhood, Peg intercepted it. She read it aloud at the kitchen table, her voice bright with mockery. "You don't need anyone else, Peter," she told him, folding the letter into her apron pocket. "You have me." The boy never wrote to a girl again, not for years, not until he was old enough to leave her orbit, which in some ways he never truly was. Graham Stark, who would become one of his closest friends in adulthood, recalled that Peg telephoned her son multiple times a day, every day, for decades. She chose his clothes. She managed his money. She commented on his women. This continued until her death in 1967. He was 42 years old. The first woman in his life established a rule from which he would never fully escape. Love meant total possession. There was no other kind. He would spend the rest of his life seeking precisely this, and then destroying it the moment he found it, because the thing he craved was the thing he could not survive. But before the women, before the marriages, before the breakdowns, there was the war, and the war gave him something Peg could not. An audience that did not belong to her. In 1943, at the age of 18, Richard Henry Sellers, already calling himself Peter, was called up for service in the Royal Air Force. He was assigned as a drummer in a camp entertainment orchestra, and almost immediately he began doing what he had been doing since infancy, performing. He organized concerts for the troops. He staged comedy sketches. He imitated officers, sergeant majors, chaplains, and cooks with a precision that delighted his fellow servicemen and occasionally alarmed his superiors. He also carried a reel-to-reel tape recorder wherever he went, a bulky contraption that he lugged from barracks to canteen to rehearsal room, recording every voice he encountered. He was not merely entertaining himself. He was building an archive, a library of other people, carefully catalogued and stored to be deployed when needed. It was, in retrospect, the toolbox of a man who was constructing an entire career, an entire identity, out of borrowed parts. The most consequential moment of his military service, however, was not a performance but a telephone call. Desperate for an audition at the BBC and wholly unknown, he rang the producer Roy Spear and introduced himself as Kenneth Horne, one of the biggest names in British radio at the time. Spear believed him. An appointment was made. When the deception was uncovered, when the nervous young man turned up at Broadcasting House and was plainly not Kenneth Horne, Spear could have thrown him out. Instead, he paused, studied the impudent young impostor, and said something that would prove prophetic. "You cheeky young sod." Then he gave him a chance. At 18, Peter Sellers had learned the central trick of his existence. To become someone, one needed only to pretend convincingly enough. The problem that would take decades to reveal its full dimensions, was that he applied this trick not only to his career, but to his friendships, his marriages, and his own sense of self. He could become anyone. He simply could not remain himself because there was, as he would later confess, nothing there to remain. After demobilization, Peg resumed command. She trailed him through theatrical agencies. She telephoned producers at inconvenient hours. She made scenes in waiting rooms when her boy was not seen quickly enough. Her determination was formidable, her methods exhausting, and her belief in his destiny absolute. Under this relentless pressure, doors began to open. By the late 1940s, he was working steadily in radio and variety. But the real transformation came in 1951, when a program called The Goon Show began broadcasting on the BBC Home Service. Its creators were three men bound together by a shared conviction that conventional comedy was a form of cowardice. Spike Milligan, the manic, brilliant, mentally fragile Irishman who wrote most of the scripts. Harry Secombe, the genial Welsh tenor who served as the show's warm centre, and Peter Sellers, who played a kaleidoscope of characters with such fluency that listeners often did not realize they were hearing one man. The show ran for 9 years and became a phenomenon. It rewrote the rules of British comedy, its influence stretching forward through the decades to touch Monty Python, alternative comedy, and virtually every British humorist who followed. For Sellers, it was a liberation. In Milligan and Secombe, he found something he had never had, a family that was not controlled by Peg. Brothers of a sort, fellow misfits. Peg despised them. She regarded the Goon Show as beneath her son, meaning it was beyond her influence, and she could not forgive them for this. The friendship between Sellers and Milligan grew intense, volatile, and ultimately enduring. Both men were brilliant. Both were psychologically damaged. Milligan suffered from severe manic depression and was hospitalized repeatedly throughout the show's run. Sellers exhibited narcissistic tendencies, bursts of paranoia, and a capacity for casual cruelty that his friends learned to endure rather than confront. They loved each other. They infuriated each other. They understood each other in the way that only two people who have looked into the same abyss can understand each other. The friendship would last until the end, battered but intact. In September 1951, the same year the Goon Show began, Peter Sellers did something that Peg had not authorized. He married. Her name was Anne Howe, and she was, in almost every respect, the opposite of Peg. Australian by birth, she was an actress of modest ambition and gentle temperament. They had met at a party thrown by a mutual friend in the London theatre world, a gathering of young performers, cigarette smoke, and cheap wine, the kind of evening that produces either nothing or everything. For them, it produced a marriage. They wed on the 15th of September, 1951, in London. He was 26. She was willing to abandon her own career for his, and she did so without apparent resentment, at least in the beginning. A son, Michael, was born on the 2nd of April, 1954. A daughter, Sarah, followed on the 16th of October, 1957. For a brief period, a handful of years, perhaps fewer, the young family resembled something approaching normality. There were Sunday lunches and pushchairs in the park, and the domestic rituals that conventional families observe. But Peter Sellers was not conventional, and the rituals did not hold. Between projects, black depressions descended without warning and lingered without mercy. Anne described living with him as waking each morning beside a different person. On a good day, he was witty, tender, and impossibly charming, the man the world saw on screen. On a bad day, he was withdrawn, hostile, consumed by a self-loathing so intense it radiated outward and burned everyone nearby. There was no middle register, no neutral setting. The switch flipped from light to dark with no discernible cause, and Anne, who had married one man, discovered that she was sharing a house with dozens. His career, at least, was ascending. In 1955, he appeared in The Ladykillers, the Ealing comedy that introduced his gift for sinister whimsy to cinema audiences. In 1959, he starred in I'm All Right, Jack, a biting satire of British class warfare that earned him a BAFTA and proved he could carry a film on his own. That same year, he and the Goons produced a short film called The Running, Jumping, and Standing Still film, an 11-minute burst of improvised lunacy shot in a field over 2 days. It was nominated for an Academy Award. Hollywood had noticed. And then, in 1960, he met the woman who would detonate the marriage, his composure, and very nearly his sanity. They divorced in 1974. No drama, no public acrimony. Just the quiet sound of two people who had never had anything in common acknowledging what had been obvious from the beginning. His third marriage ended the way a candle goes out in a room with no draught. Not extinguished, merely exhausted. Between the wedding and the divorce, however, there was an interlude of such compressed absurdity that it deserves its own paragraph, if only to demonstrate the velocity at which this man made romantic decisions. In May 1973, Peter Sellers met Lisa Minnelli. 3 days later, they were engaged. The announcement was made publicly. Friends were informed. Plans, presumably, were discussed. The engagement lasted approximately 1 month. The precise reasons for its dissolution have never been fully documented, but the available evidence suggests a reversal of his usual pattern. In his marriages, the women eventually fled from his intensity. With Minnelli, the flight went the other direction. She appears to have recognized, with commendable speed, the scale of his instability, and she withdrew before the engagement could progress to a marriage that would have added a 5th chapter to an already overcrowded romantic history. It was one of the very few occasions in his life when a woman left before he had the opportunity to drive her away. He did not take it well. To Graham Stark, He described Manelli in terms that Stark would later recount with weary familiarity. She was, Sellers declared, the woman of his life. Stark, who had heard this declaration before, about Anne, about Britt, about Sophia, and about several others who had not achieved the status of matrimony, responded with the gentle sarcasm of a man who has watched the same play too many times. Another woman, Stark said quietly. Another absolute conviction. Another inevitable collapse. The exact words have not been preserved, but the spirit is well documented. Stark had stopped believing in Sellers' certainties years ago. Meanwhile, his career had reached its lowest point. The films of the early 1970s were, with few exceptions, dreadful. The critics who had celebrated Dr. Strangelove and the Goon Show now wrote about him in the past tense. He was spoken of as a talent that had burned too brightly and consumed itself. He was discussed at dinner parties with the particular mixture of admiration and pity that the English reserve for geniuses who have outlived their genius. He considered retiring. He began purchasing property in Ireland. He spoke to friends about a quiet life, a cottage, a garden, the kind of modest existence that would have been inconceivable to the boy Peg, had dressed like a prince and paraded through the backstage corridors of provincial music halls. Whether he was serious about this retreat or merely performing the idea of seriousness is impossible to know. With Peter Sellers, the distinction between genuine intention and elaborate role play was never clear, least of all to himself. And then Blake Edwards telephoned. Edwards was the director who had created Inspector Clouseau, the bumbling, self-important French detective whose moustache was as unreliable as his deductive reasoning in the original Pink Panther film of 1963. The character had been a sensation. Sellers had made him immortal. And now, in 1974, with both men's careers in varying states of disrepair, Edwards proposed a reunion, the return of the Pink Panther. The relationship between the two men was, by this point, extraordinarily toxic. They had fought during the original productions, over tone, over direction, over the fundamental question of who controlled the character. Edwards was a disciplined craftsman who believed in scripts, schedules, and the authority of the director. Sellers was an improviser who believed in nothing except the moment and the character who lived inside it. These methods were incompatible, and their collisions produced both magnificent comedy and genuine hatred. Sellers had threatened to walk off the set of The Pink Panther Strikes Again, and would have done so had the financial consequences not been made extremely clear by the studio's lawyers. Edwards, for his part, would later channel his frustrations into a 1981 film called S.O.B., in which a director drives an actor to destruction. He acknowledged, when asked, that the parallels were not entirely coincidental. But in 1974, both men needed each other. Edwards needed a hit. Sellers needed proof that he was not finished. And Clouseau, that magnificent, infuriating, endlessly renewable creation, needed both of them. The Return of the Pink Panther was released in 1975. It earned many times its modest budget. Critics were generous. Audiences were ecstatic. And Peter Sellers, who had been eulogized by the British press as a spent force, was suddenly and improbably resurrected. The irony was exquisite, and he felt it keenly. The role he despised, the character he regarded as beneath his abilities, a clown's suit he was forced to wear because the public demanded it, was the role that saved him. He dreamed of being recognized as a serious artist. He longed for the respect accorded to Olivier, to Guinness, to the theatrical knights whose approval he craved and never received. Instead, he was beloved for pratfalls and a French accent. Inspector Clouseau was his pension, his insurance policy, and his prison. He wore the moustache and accepted the check and quietly seethed. 2 years later, he married for the fourth and final time. The pattern, by now, was so familiar it had acquired the inevitability of a natural law. Infatuation, possession, disillusion, destruction. Only the names changed. The architecture remained the same. Lynn Frederick was 22 years old, a British actress of modest reputation, born on the 25th of July, 1954. He was 51. The gap between them, 29 years, was not merely numerical. It was geologic. He had lived through the Second World War, the decline of the British Empire, the birth and death of rock and roll, and 3 marriages. She had been alive for the moon landing. They married on the 18th of February, 1977. Friends and colleagues received the news with reactions ranging from resignation to despair. Spike Milligan, whose affection for Sellers had survived decades of provocation, observed the situation with the grim clarity of a man who has watched a friend walk into traffic once too often. The marriage is built on foundations that would not support a garden shed, let alone a human relationship, he said to a mutual friend. He was right. He was always right about Sellers, which was why Sellers found his honesty both indispensable and unendurable. 1 month after the wedding, on the 20th of March, 1977, Sellers suffered his second major cardiac arrest. This time, the doctors installed a pacemaker, a small electronic device that would monitor his heart rhythm and deliver corrective shocks when the organ faltered. They also delivered a prognosis that was, by any clinical standard, bleak. His heart was severely compromised. Further attacks were likely. Complete rest was essential. He ignored all of it. He continued to work, to travel, to argue, to smoke, to drink, to consume himself with the focused determination of a man who regarded medical advice as a form of creative interference. He had a machine in his chest now, a device that stood between him and death, ticking away in the silence like a mechanical understudy waiting in the wings. He lived with it for 3 years. It kept him alive. It did not make him careful. Those 3 years, from the spring of 1977 to the summer of 1980, were characterized by a strange and volatile mixture of creative brilliance and personal disintegration, as though the proximity of death had simultaneously sharpened his talent and dissolved whatever remained of his capacity for human connection. In 1978, he appeared as a guest on The Muppet Show, the Jim Henson program that had become one of the most popular variety shows on television. The producers invited him to be himself. He declined. He could not, he explained, play himself because he had no idea who that person was. Instead, he appeared in a succession of costumes and accents: a Viking, a German general, a member of the royal family, inhabiting each character with absolute conviction and vacating each with equal speed. He was the only guest in the show's history who refused to appear as himself, and the episode earned a nomination for an Emmy Award. The puppets, constructed from felt and foam and operated by human hands, possessed more consistent identities than their guest. The marriage to Lynn, meanwhile, was deteriorating along predictable lines. By 1978, they were living largely apart. Arguments escalated into confrontations. Confrontations escalated into silences that could last for days. The domestic arrangement bore less resemblance to a marriage than to a siege, with both parties entrenched in their positions and neither willing to capitulate. Yet he did not divorce her. Whether this was inertia, financial calculation, residual affection, or simply the exhaustion of a man who had divorced 3 times and lacked the energy for a fourth, is unclear. The marriage endured, not because it functioned, but because ending it required a vitality he no longer possessed. And then, in 1979, he was offered the role he had been chasing for nearly a decade, and the final act of his career produced the finest performance of his life. The novel was called Being There. It had been written by Jerzy Kosinski, a Polish-American author whose own biography was almost as contested as the fiction he produced, and it told the story of a man named Chance the gardener, who had spent his entire life inside a single house, tending plants and watching television. When circumstances forced him into the outside world, he spoke in the only language he possessed, the simple observations of a gardener and the borrowed phrases of the television programs he had absorbed since childhood. He said things like, "In the garden, growth has its season, and there will be growth in the spring." The people around him, politicians, financiers, journalists, mistook his emptiness for profundity. They projected onto his blankness whatever meaning they wished to find. He became an advisor to presidents. He was spoken of as a future leader, and none of it was real because there was nothing behind the surface. Chance was not wise. He was not foolish. He was simply not there. Peter Sellers read the novel around 1971 and recognized himself immediately. He contacted Kosinski. He declared his intention to play Chance. He pursued the project with a persistence that surprised even those who knew him well, because persistence was not typically among his qualities. He was a man of eruptions, not campaigns. But this was different. This role was not a character to be inhabited and discarded. It was a confession. It was the closest thing to an autobiography that a man without a self could produce. The film was launched and abandoned multiple times over the following years. Studios were uncertain. Financiers wavered. Directors attached themselves and detached themselves with the regularity of commuters boarding and leaving trains. Nearly a decade passed. And then, in 1978, the director Hal Ashby, a gentle, bearded, quietly unconventional filmmaker whose previous work included Harold and Maude and Coming Home, agreed to take the project on. Shooting began, and something remarkable happened. Peter Sellers, the man who had raged at directors, thrown furniture, locked himself in trailers, demanded rewrites, refused to follow scripts, and made the lives of virtually every collaborator a prolonged exercise in crisis management, became calm. Shirley MacLaine, who played the female lead, described him as a different person. Not different in the way his friends had described the change after the 1964 cardiac arrests. Not harder, not stranger, not more volatile. Different in the opposite direction. Quieter, more present, more still. Hal Ashby, observing from behind the camera, offered an assessment that sounded paradoxical but was, in context, entirely precise. Sellers had stopped acting and had finally become himself. The paradox deserves examination because it contains the key to the entire story. For 53 years, Peter Sellers had been unable to locate a stable identity. He had searched for it in his mother's approval, in 4 marriages, in an uncountable number of characters, in mysticism, in drugs, in the backseat of fast cars, and in the arms of women who represented, each in turn, the possibility of completion. He had not found it, but in Chance the Gardener, a character defined entirely by the absence of identity, he found something that functioned, for the first time, as a mirror that reflected truthfully. The reflection was emptiness. And in playing emptiness honestly, without decoration or disguise, he achieved a kind of authenticity that had eluded him in every other context of his life. It was, by any measure, the greatest performance of his career. It was also, by any measure, the saddest. Because the role that finally allowed him to be himself was the role of a man who was nobody at all. The film was released in December 1979 to widespread critical acclaim. Sellers was praised in terms that would have gratified him enormously had they not arrived so late and at such cost. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor, the recognition he had craved for decades, the validation that would confirm what he had always believed and never been able to prove, that he was not merely a comedian, not merely a clown in a French moustache, but an artist of the highest order. The ceremony took place in April 1980 at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles. The other nominees included Dustin Hoffman for Kramer vs. Kramer, Jack Lemmon for The China Syndrome, Al Pacino for And Justice for All, and Roy Scheider for All That Jazz. It was a formidable field, but Sellers believed, with the absolute conviction he brought to all beliefs, that the award was his. He did not attend the ceremony in person. He watched the broadcast from a distance, and when the envelope was opened and the name read aloud was Dustin Hoffman, something in him contracted. He did not shout. He did not throw anything. According to the account preserved by Ed Sikov, his biographer, he simply looked at the television screen for a long moment, then reached forward and turned it off. The room went dark. He said nothing. In the silence that followed, his fury assembled itself into a theory. The Academy, he concluded, had been influenced by a promotional reel that the studio had assembled, a montage of outtakes and alternate takes in which he could be seen laughing, breaking character, joking with the crew between setups. The reel, he believed, had demonstrated to the voters that he was not really acting, that Chance the Gardener was not a performance, but simply Peter Sellers being Peter Sellers, and therefore not worthy of the profession's highest honor. He was correct about the reel's effect, or at least plausible in his assessment of it. Where he was wrong, where the irony achieved its most devastating precision, was in his interpretation of what the reel revealed. He had indeed not been acting. He had indeed been himself. But for Peter Sellers, being himself was the most difficult and most courageous artistic act of his entire career. The Academy did not understand this. They saw a man relaxing into a role. He saw a man who had spent 53 years unable to relax into anything and had finally, briefly, managed it, only to be told that the achievement did not count. It was the last major disappointment of his professional life. What remained was personal, and it was worse. The marriage to Lynn Frederick, which had been disintegrating for years, now existed only as a legal formality and a source of mutual resentment. They lived apart more often than together. When they were together, the encounters were volatile. She accused him of neglect. He accused her of opportunism. Neither accusation was entirely without foundation. His relationship with his children had, by this point, passed beyond estrangement into something closer to renunciation. In 1979 or early 1980, accounts vary on the precise date, he entered into open conflict with Victoria, his daughter from the marriage to Britt Eklund. At a dinner, he threw a drink over her. The gesture was deliberate. The humiliation was public. Subsequently, he sent a telegram in which he formally disowned her. The language was unambiguous. The cruelty was deliberate. By the time of his death, he was alienated from all three of his children. Michael, Sarah, and Victoria, born to two different mothers over a span of 11 years, had each, in their own way, been sacrificed to the same pattern. Absolute love or absolute rejection, total devotion or total withdrawal. The mechanism Peg had installed operated with mechanical reliability across 4 decades and 3 generations, and not one of its victims had found a way to disable it. He knew this. The evidence suggests that he knew it and was powerless to alter it, which is perhaps the most charitable interpretation available, though charity was not a quality he extended to himself or to others with any consistency. He joked about it darkly, as he joked about everything. He proposed his own epitaph, star of stage, screen, and alimony. It was funny. It was also a confession, disguised as wit, that the only lasting product of his personal life was the money he paid to the women he had failed. In the early months of 1980, his body began its final deterioration. He was working on what would be his last completed film, The Fiendish Plot of Dr. Fu Manchu, a production that pleased no one, least of all its star, who was visibly unwell throughout the shoot, and whose performances bore the hallmarks of a man operating on reserves that were nearly spent. He also filmed a television advertisement for Barclays Bank, in which he played a series of characters, including, with characteristic irony, a Jewish confidence trickster. During the shoot, he collapsed. He was helped to his feet. He continued working. The body was failing, but stopping was not an option, because stopping meant being alone with himself, and being alone with himself was the one thing he had spent 54 years learning to avoid. Discussions were underway for a new Clouseau film, Romance of the Pink Panther, with Blake Edwards once more at the helm. Contracts were being negotiated. Schedules were being drawn up. The machinery of production was engaging its gears, indifferent to the condition of the man around whom it revolved. And then, on the 22nd of July, 1980, 2 things happened. The first was that Peter Sellers contacted his solicitor to arrange a meeting. He wished to change his will. He wanted to remove Lynn Frederick as the principal beneficiary and redistribute his estate in favor of his children, the same children he had disowned, ignored, and hurt for decades. Whether this represented genuine remorse, a final act of spite against his wife, or simply the pragmatic calculation of a dying man who wished to ensure his money outlived his grievances, is impossible to determine. The meeting was scheduled. The new will was to be drawn up. The second thing that happened was that he went to lunch at the Dorchester Hotel in London with a small gathering of friends and associates. During the meal, he became unwell. The discomfort escalated rapidly into agony. He was taken from the restaurant and rushed to the Middlesex Hospital, where doctors confirmed what his pacemaker had been struggling to prevent for 3 years, a massive heart attack. His heart, which had failed him on at least 8 previous occasions, some estimates place the number as high as 15, was failing him for the last time. He was admitted. He was treated. He did not recover. Shortly after midnight, on the 24th of July, 1980, Peter Sellers died. He was 54 years old. He had not changed his will. The consequences of this omission were immediate, devastating, and in their own grim way, perfectly consistent with the pattern of his life. Under the existing will, Lynn Frederick inherited virtually the entire estate, valued at approximately £4.5 million, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, represented a considerable fortune. His 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and Victoria, received £800 each, £800, from a multi-million-pound estate, for an entire childhood without a father. For unanswered telephone calls and cancelled visits, and a bracelet given and taken away, and a drink thrown across a dinner table, and a telegram that said, "You are no longer mine." £800 was not an inheritance. It was a punchline. And like most of his punchlines, it was funny only if you were not the person it landed on. When Graham Stark learned the terms of the will, he was silent for a long time. £800, he said finally. He spent more than that on flowers for Sophia. Lynn Frederick married the television presenter David Frost in 1981. They divorced within 12 months. She subsequently sold various rights to Sellers' films and managed the estate with a commercial efficiency that his children regarded as predatory and his friends regarded as inevitable. The estate continued to generate income and revenue from the Pink Panther franchise, from Casino Royale, from the vast catalogue of work he had left behind. By some estimates, the total value of the Sellers' estate exceeded £100 million by the early 2010s. The money flowed. The man was gone. The disparity between the two facts was, perhaps, the final absurdity. Lynn Frederick died on the 27th of April, 1994, at the age of 39. The cause was recorded as a combination of alcohol and medication. The official verdict was accidental death. She had outlived her former husband by 14 years. She had inherited his fortune. She had not, by any available account, inherited anything resembling peace. The funeral of Peter Sellers took place in accordance with instructions he had left in his will, the same will that disinherited his children, the same will he had tried and failed to alter on the day his heart gave out. Among the instructions was a specification regarding music. He requested that the congregation listen to In the Mood by Glenn Miller. He had despised that song for his entire life. He found it saccharine, banal, and insufferable. He had complained about it to friends, to colleagues, to anyone who would listen. He thought it represented everything that was mediocre and unimaginative about popular taste. He chose it for his funeral. It was his last performance, his last joke. His final demonstration of the principle that had governed his existence from the moment Peg carried him onto the stage of the King's Theatre in Southsea. Even in death, he could not be himself, because there was no self to be. A man who hated a song chose it for his own farewell, and the mourners sat in the pews and listened to it, and some of them laughed, and some of them wept, and none of them could say with certainty which response he would have preferred. The story should have ended there, with the music he hated, and the will he did not change, and the silence of a hospital room shortly after midnight. Stories about famous men usually end with their deaths, because death provides the kind of structural neatness that life refuses to supply. The curtain falls. The credits roll. The biographer writes the final paragraph and closes the laptop. But this story did not end on the 24th of July, 1980. It continued through the lives of the people he had left behind, through the money that kept accumulating in accounts he could no longer access, through the arguments and silences and small private griefs of those who had loved him, and through a coincidence so precise and so terrible that no novelist would dare to invent it. Let us begin with the children. There were 3 of them, born to 2 different mothers over a span of 11 years, and each of them carried into adulthood a different fragment of the same wound. Michael Sellers, the firstborn son, spent his life in the gravitational field of a father who was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. His father's face was on cinema screens, on magazine covers, on the television sets of strangers in every country on earth. His father's voice, or rather, his father's many voices, echoed through living rooms and revival theaters and late-night broadcasts. The world could not get enough of Peter Sellers. Michael could not get any of him at all. He tried acting. The career did not flourish. He was competent but unremarkable, and the surname that should have opened doors instead turned every audition into a comparison he could not win. Directors looked at him and saw the father's shadow, and the shadow was so large that the son could not step outside it. He took small roles. He worked steadily, but without distinction. He was, in the cruelest possible sense, an ordinary man carrying an extraordinary name, a condition that sounds trivial until one considers what it means to be reminded every single day that one's father was a genius and that one is not. In 1981, a year after his father's death, Michael published a memoir titled P.S. I Love You. The title itself a masterpiece of compressed anguish, simultaneously a standard epistolary sign-off and the desperate message of a son who had spent his life waiting for the postscript that never arrived. The book was honest. It was painful. It presented his father without embellishment or excuse. The charm and the cruelty, the brilliance and the abandonment, the man who could make the whole world laugh and could not make his own children feel safe. It was the kind of book that could only be written by someone who had given up hope of reconciliation, because reconciliation requires a living counterpart, and Peter Sellers was in the ground. The book did not make Michael rich. It did not make him famous, except in the reflected, second-hand way that the children of famous people are always famous, recognized not for who they are, but for who they came from. What it did do, perhaps, was provide a kind of closure. He had told his story. He had set down, in ink and paper, the account of what it had been like to be Peter Sellers' son. The account was not flattering. It was not vindictive. It was simply true, and the truth, for a family that had lived inside a hall of mirrors for decades, was itself a radical act. Michael lived for another quarter of a century after that book was published. He lived quietly, away from the industry that had consumed his father. He married. He built a life that bore little resemblance to the chaos from which he had emerged. He found, it appears, a measure of the peace that his father had spent 54 years failing to locate. And then, on the 24th of July, 2006, precisely 26 years to the day after his father's death, Michael Sellers suffered a heart attack and died. He was 52 years old. His father had been 54. The same date, the same organ, the same failure. 26 years apart. A father and a son departed through the same door on the same day of the same month, and the symmetry was so exact that it seemed less like coincidence than like the final line of a story that had been writing itself across generations, indifferent to the wishes of the characters caught inside it. This is documented fact, confirmed by the BBC, the Telegraph, and multiple independent sources, not embellishment or legend. It happened. The universe, which is not known for its sense of narrative structure, produced a conclusion that no screenwriter would have been permitted to submit, on the grounds that it was too neat, too cruel, and too obviously symbolic. Life, it turns out, is a less disciplined storyteller than the critics demand. Sarah Sellers, the younger of the two children from the marriage to Anne Howe, chose a different path entirely. She withdrew from public life almost completely. She did not write a memoir. She did not give interviews. She did not appear on television chat shows to discuss her father's legacy. She did not, as far as the public record indicates, seek to profit from or to process her father's memory through any visible medium. She simply lived, privately, quietly, on her own terms, in a manner that suggested either a profound desire for normalcy or a profound revulsion at the alternative. Of the three children, she is the one about whom the least is known, and perhaps this is itself a kind of eloquence. Silence, in a family defined by performance, is the most radical possible statement. Where her father had filled every room with noise and characters, and the desperate energy of a man who could not bear to be alone with himself, Sarah chose stillness. It was, in its way, the most complete repudiation of his legacy that any of his children achieved. Victoria Sellers, the daughter born to Britt Eklund on the 20th of January, 1965, became an actress. She appeared in films and television programs of varying quality and distinction throughout the 1980s and 90s. She had inherited her mother's beauty and her father's restlessness, though not mercifully, his self-destructive genius. In the rare interviews she granted, she spoke of her father with the particular mixture of tenderness and bewilderment that characterizes people who loved someone they were never permitted to know properly. She was the girl who had been disowned by telegram, the girl whose father had thrown a drink over her at a dinner table and then sent a written notice of renunciation, as though fatherhood were a contract that could be terminated by post. She was also the girl who remembered, presumably, moments of warmth and play and laughter, and the intoxicating experience of being the child of the funniest man in the room, the man who could do all the voices and pull all the faces and make the world disappear behind a wall of comedy. The two memories, the warmth and the telegram, coexisted, because that is what memories of difficult parents do. They do not resolve. They simply accumulate, layer upon layer, until the person carrying them can no longer distinguish love from damage, because in her family they were the same thing. Now let us turn to the wives, the four women who entered the orbit of Peter Sellers and emerged from it at various speeds and in various states of repair. Anne Howe, his first wife, lived quietly after their divorce in 1963. She remarried. She raised Michael and Sarah largely alone, providing the stability and consistency that their father could not offer and did not attempt. She built a life away from the theatre and the cinema, a life that did not depend on applause or recognition or the approval of strangers. She had been married to Peter Sellers for 12 years. She had borne him 2 children. She had endured his infidelities. his obsession with Sophia Loren, his rages, his depressions, and his ultimate abandonment. She had watched him fall in love with another woman while sitting across the breakfast table from her, and she had survived it, which is more than can be said for the marriage. The world remembered him. It forgot her almost entirely. Her name appeared in obituaries and biographies primarily as a footnote, first wife, mother of his two eldest children, as though 12 years of devotion to an impossible man could be summarized in a subordinate clause. She deserved better. Most of the people in this story deserved better. Britt Ekland outlived her former husband by decades and showed no inclination to be forgotten. She continued to act, to model, to appear on television programs in which her beauty and her famous past were the principal commodities on offer. She published True Brit in 1980, the year of his death, a timing that was either coincidental or calculated, and most of his friends believed the latter, and spoke of him for the rest of her career with a candor that was sometimes generous and sometimes savage, but never indifferent. He had been, she acknowledged in interviews, the most gifted and the most impossible person she had ever encountered. She described the marriage as a kind of magnificent imprisonment, a gilded cage in which the captor was also the entertainer, and the entertainment was so brilliant that one almost forgot one was caged. He could make you feel like the only woman in the world, she said in one interview, years after the divorce. And then, 5 minutes later, he could make you feel like you didn't exist at all. The problem was he didn't either. It was, perhaps, the most perceptive single sentence ever spoken about Peter Sellers by anyone who knew him, and it came not from a biographer or a psychiatrist, but from a woman who had knelt on a bedroom floor at 3 o'clock in the morning while his heart stopped beating. Miranda Quarry, his third wife, faded from public view after their divorce in 1974 with a thoroughness that suggested either discretion or relief. She married again. She returned to the quiet, respectable circles of the British upper class from which she had briefly emerged to marry a comedian. She gave no interviews. She wrote no memoirs. She made no claims upon his legacy. The marriage had lasted 4 years and produced no children, no scandals, and no stories worth telling, which, given the pyrotechnics of his other marriages, was perhaps its most distinctive achievement. She had been, for 4 years, the wife of Peter Sellers, and the experience had left so little visible trace that one might reasonably wonder whether it had happened at all. Lynn Frederick, as has been noted, inherited the estate and married David Frost in 1981. The marriage to Frost lasted barely a year before ending in divorce, a brevity that recalled, uncomfortably, the velocity of her courtship with Sellers. She subsequently managed the Sellers estate with a commercial efficiency that his children regarded as predatory and his friends regarded as inevitable. She sold rights. She licensed properties. She defended the estate's interests with the tenacity of a woman who understood that the money was the only tangible thing the marriage had produced and was determined to keep it. The estate continued to generate income long after both Sellers and Frederick were dead, revenue from the Pink Panther franchise, from Casino Royale, from Dr. Strangelove, from the vast and seemingly inexhaustible catalogue of work he had left behind. By some estimates, the total value of the Sellers estate exceeded £100 million by the early 2010s. The money flowed like water through a broken dam, enriching successors and lawyers and corporate entities, none of whom had ever heard the man's real laugh or watched him stare at a wall for 3 hours because he could not remember who he was supposed to be that day. Lynn Frederick died on the 27th of April, 1994, at the age of 39. The cause was recorded as a combination of alcohol and medication. The official verdict was accidental death. She had outlived her former husband by 14 years. She had inherited his fortune. She had not, by any available account, inherited anything resembling peace. She was buried, and the money continued to accumulate in accounts that bore her name. And then, after her death, other names, names that had no connection to Peter Sellers at all. Names that belonged to people who had never met him, never loved him, never been damaged by him, and who regarded his estate simply as a revenue stream, which is perhaps the most honest way to regard the legacy of a man who spent his life pretending to be other people. Spike Milligan, the truest and most durable of his friends, survived until the 27th of February, 2002. He was 83. His own life had been characterized by the same volatile compound of brilliance and psychological suffering that had defined Sellers, though Milligan's suffering was more openly acknowledged and more honestly confronted. He spoke publicly about his breakdowns, his hospitalizations, his struggles with the manic depression that pursued him like a creditor who could not be paid off and would not negotiate terms. He did not hide behind characters. He did not pretend to be someone else. He simply endured with a courage that was less dramatic than Sellers' pyrotechnics but infinitely more sustainable. His epitaph, inscribed on his headstone in Winchelsea, East Sussex, reads, "Duart me leet go rabe me brioit." It is written in Irish Gaelic. Translated, it means, "I told you I was ill." The inscription exists in Gaelic rather than English because the Diocese of Chichester refused to permit a joke on a gravestone in the language of the Church of England. Milligan's family, displaying the same cheerful defiance of bureaucratic authority that had characterized the Goon show, simply switched languages. The joke survived. The bureaucrats were outmaneuvered. And the dead man, who had spent his life fighting institutions that lacked a sense of humor, won his last battle from beneath 6 feet of Sussex clay. It was, in its way, the perfect counterpoint to the funeral of Peter Sellers. Milligan's epitaph was honest, brutally, comically, heartbreakingly honest. It said exactly what it meant. There was no mask, no misdirection, no performance. "I told you I was ill" is the statement of a man who knows precisely who he is, knows precisely what ails him, and has decided that the most dignified response to both knowledge and ailment is a joke, a real joke, not a disguise. Sellers' funeral music, by contrast, was a lie, a deliberate, calculated, exquisitely crafted lie. He chose a song he hated because even in death, the instinct to perform, to deceive, to be anyone other than himself, was stronger than the instinct to tell the truth. The two friends, united in life by their shared gift for making people laugh, were divided in death by their opposite relationships to authenticity. Milligan knew who he was and said so. Sellers did not know who he was and never stopped pretending. Graham Stark, who had known Sellers longer than almost anyone, and who had served as both witness and confessor to his friend's slow disintegration, lived until the 21st of September, 2013. He was 91. In his final years, he published additional memoirs and gave interviews in which he reflected on the man he had known since the early days of the Goon Show, more than half a century of friendship, a span that encompassed 4 marriages, at least 8 cardiac arrests, dozens of films, and an incalculable number of telephone calls, arguments, reconciliations, and shared silences. Stark's accounts were marked by a kind of weary affection, the perspective of someone who had loved a friend deeply, while never quite forgiving him for the damage he caused. He described Sellers without illusions, but also without contempt, which is the rarest and most valuable kind of testimony available, because most people who knew Sellers intimately ended up either worshipping him or hating him, and Stark managed, through some miracle of emotional equilibrium, to do neither. Which brings us, finally, to the question that has haunted every page of this account, every marriage, every cardiac arrest, every character he inhabited and abandoned. Who was Peter Sellers? He himself provided the most frequently quoted answer. In interviews conducted at various points throughout his career, early, middle, and late, in periods of triumph and periods of despair, in moments of apparent candor and moments of obvious performance, he returned to the same confession with the regularity of a man circling a drain. If you ask me to play myself, I will not know what to do. I do not know who or what I am. On another occasion, with the precision of a surgeon describing his own autopsy, there is no me. I do not exist. There used to be a me, but I had it surgically removed. These statements have been analyzed, interpreted, and diagnosed by professionals and amateurs alike for more than 4 decades. The interpretations fall, broadly, into 3 categories, and none of them is entirely satisfactory, and all of them contain a portion of the truth. The first is clinical. The biographers Roger Lewis and Ed Sikov, approaching from different angles, but arriving at compatible conclusions, suggest that Sellers exhibited characteristics consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, possibly compounded by borderline features, a condition characterized by an unstable sense of self, intense and volatile relationships, a paralyzing terror of abandonment, and a tendency to oscillate between idealization and devaluation of the people closest to him. The diagnosis fits. It fits the 4 marriages, each of which began with an explosion of idealization and ended with an implosion of contempt. It fits the disowned children, who were loved absolutely until they failed to meet an impossible standard, and were then discarded absolutely. It fits the obsessive need for approval, followed by the compulsive destruction of every relationship that provided it. It fits the empty center, the void where an identity should have been. Whether a formal diagnosis was ever made during his lifetime is not part of the public record. The symptoms, however, are. The second interpretation is professional. Shirley MacLaine, Hal Ashby, and others who worked with him at his best suggested that his absent identity was not a pathology, but a tool, the very quality that made him the greatest character actor of his generation. An actor with a strong sense of self brings that self to every role, and the audience sees it, however skillfully it is disguised. An actor with no self has nothing to bring. He is a vessel, empty and waiting to be filled. The result is not impersonation, but transformation, not the simulation of another person, but the actual, temporary replacement of one consciousness with another. This was Sellers' gift. It was also his curse, because the vessel, once emptied, cannot be refilled with its original contents if those contents never existed in the first place. The gift and the affliction were inseparable. To cure the emptiness would have been to destroy the talent. To preserve the talent was to perpetuate the emptiness. There was no resolution, only an endless oscillation between the two. The third interpretation is biographical, and it is the simplest and the most human. Graham Stark, who knew him longer and more intimately than almost anyone, traced the emptiness back to its source, Peg. She had loved him so completely, so possessively, and so early that she had occupied the space where a self should have formed. She had filled him with her own ambitions, her own identity, her own desperate need for applause, and had left no room for anything that was authentically his. He was, in Stark's view, not a man without a self, but a man whose self had been overwritten before it could be installed. A blank page on which his mother had written her own story in indelible ink, and then insisted, with absolute authority, that he perform it for the rest of his life. The self was not missing, it was buried, and the weight of everything Peg had placed on top of it, the name of a dead brother, the backstage childhood, the intercepted letters, the telephone calls that continued into his 40s, was too great for him to excavate, even if he had known it was there, which he may not have. None of these interpretations accounts for everything. The clinical model explains the cruelty, but not the genius. The professional model explains the genius, but not the cruelty. The biographical model explains both, but relies on a single cause for an enormously complex effect, and human beings are rarely that simple, even when they appear to be. Perhaps the truth, if truth is even the right word for the interior landscape of a man who made a career of falsification, lies in some combination of all three, or in a fourth possibility that has not yet been articulated and may never be. What can be said with certainty is this: Peter Sellers changed the art of screen acting. Before him, the boundary between a performer and a character was visible, a seam that the audience accepted as part of the craft. Laurence Olivier was always, visibly, Laurence Olivier, even when he was Hamlet or Richard III or Archie Rice. The performance was brilliant, but the man behind it was always present, like a signature in the corner of a painting. Sellers erased the signature. When he played Clouseau, there was no Peter Sellers visible anywhere, no residual mannerism, no habitual gesture, no trace of the man behind the moustache. When he played Strangelove, the man behind the character had vanished so completely that audiences sometimes forgot they were watching the same actor who had played the president in the previous scene and the group captain in the scene before that. This was not technique in the conventional sense. It was not method acting as Stanislavski or Strasberg would have recognized it. It was the natural consequence of having no fixed identity to begin with. He did not disappear into his characters. He disappeared, full stop, and his characters moved into the vacated space. Without this innovation, if innovation is the right word for a quality that was as much affliction as achievement, the subsequent history of screen acting would look markedly different. Daniel Day-Lewis, who famously remained in character between takes and refused to answer to his own name during production, was walking a path that Sellers had cleared. He stayed in the accent, the posture, the psychological state of whatever character he was playing, Lincoln, Plainview, Christy Brown, even when the cameras were not rolling, pursuing a totality of immersion that Sellers had achieved not through discipline, but through the simple fact of having nowhere else to go. Gary Oldman, whose physical transformations rendered him virtually unrecognizable from role to role, punk rocker in Sid and Nancy, vampire in Dracula, Churchill in Darkest Hour, was operating within a tradition that Sellers had established. The tradition of the invisible actor, the performer who vanishes so completely that the audience forgets there ever was a performer. Christian Bale, who gained and lost alarming amounts of weight in pursuit of verisimilitude, and who once described his own approach as removing myself from the equation, was pursuing an ideal that Sellers had embodied decades earlier, though Sellers would not have described it as an ideal. For him, it was simply the only way he knew how to exist. None of these actors would necessarily cite Sellers as a direct influence. The genealogy of artistic influence is rarely that simple, and actors are notoriously reluctant to acknowledge debts to their predecessors. But all of them work in a landscape that Sellers created, a landscape in which the complete erasure of the performer is not merely possible but desirable, in which the actor's own identity is regarded as an obstacle to be overcome rather than an asset to be deployed. And then there is the parallel that demands acknowledgement, because to ignore it would be to miss a pattern that extends beyond any single life. Robin Williams, another comedian of extraordinary range and protean talent, another man who could become anyone and who masked a profound interior darkness with an exterior of manic energy and relentless humor, took his own life in August 2014. The circumstances were different. The era was different. The specific pathologies were different. Williams had been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, a condition that was eroding his cognitive function and his sense of self in ways that were medically explicable, but no less devastating for being so. But the underlying architecture was disturbingly similar. A man who made the world laugh, who could not make himself happy, and whose death revealed a chasm between the public persona and the private suffering that the public had never been invited to see. Comedy, it appears, is not a cure for despair. It is, at best, a magnificent and temporary disguise, a way of holding the darkness at arm's length for as long as the performance lasts, and not 1 second longer. The last scene of being there, the last important scene in the last important film of Peter Sellers' career, shows Chance the gardener walking across the surface of a lake. He does not sink. He does not struggle. He does not even appear to notice that what he is doing is impossible. He simply walks, calmly and without apparent effort, across water that should not support him. The camera holds. No explanation is offered. No miracle is announced. The other characters do not witness it. It happens in solitude, observed only by the audience, and then the film ends. Critics and scholars have argued about this scene for decades. Some read it as a religious metaphor, Chance as a Christ figure, walking on water, innocent and unknowing. Others interpret it as the film's final satirical thrust. A man so empty that even the laws of physics cannot engage with him, because there is nothing there for gravity to grip. Others still see it as pure absurdism, a goon show punchline delivered in the language of art house cinema, a final wink from a comedian who had spent his career subverting expectations and saw no reason to stop at the last possible moment. Perhaps the simplest reading is also the most devastating. If you are no one, if there is truly nothing inside you, no weight, no substance, no self, then you cannot sink. You pass over the surface of the world without disturbing it, and the world, in turn, cannot disturb you. You are free from friction, from consequence, from the drag of identity that pulls other people down into the complicated, messy, glorious business of being someone. You can walk on water. You can make millions laugh. You can marry 4 women and father 3 children and leave them all behind without a backward glance. You can die and come back and die again, and none of it touches you because there is no you to be touched. This is not a comfortable thought. It is not intended to be. It was, perhaps, the most perceptive single sentence ever spoken about Peter Sellers by anyone who knew him, and it came not from a biographer sitting in a library with a stack of research materials, not from a psychiatrist observing from behind a professional distance, not from a critic analyzing performances frame by frame in a darkened screening room, but from a woman who had knelt on a bedroom floor at 3 o'clock in the morning while his heart stopped beating, and who had stayed. Stayed for 4 more years, stayed through the paranoia and the surveillance and the bracelet that oscillated between her wrist and his pocket like a metronome measuring the rhythm of his moods. Britt Eklund earned that sentence. She paid for it with 4 years of her youth, and the currency was not refundable. Miranda Quarry, his 3rd wife, faded from public view after their divorce in 1974 with a thoroughness that suggested either supreme discretion or profound relief, and perhaps both, since the two are not mutually exclusive. She married again. She returned to the quiet, respectable circles of the British upper class, from which she had briefly and improbably emerged to marry a comedian of all things, a man who pulled faces for a living and threw furniture when the faces did not produce the desired response. She gave no interviews about the marriage. She wrote no memoirs. She made no claims upon his legacy, financial or otherwise. She appeared in no documentaries. She offered no assessments of his character, no revelations about his behavior, no anecdotes about life inside the household of Britain's most celebrated and most unstable performer. The marriage had lasted 4 years and produced no children, no memorable scandals, and no stories worth telling in any detail, which, given the volcanic pyrotechnics of his other marriages, was perhaps its most distinctive achievement. 4 years of marriage to Peter Sellers, and nothing happened. Nothing worth recording. Nothing that rose to the level of narrative. She had been, for 4 years, the wife of the most difficult man in British entertainment, and the experience had left so little visible trace that one might reasonably wonder whether it had happened at all. Whether the marriage had been not a union, but a kind of mutual hallucination, a shared dream from which both parties had awoken simultaneously and without particular distress, and had then gone about their separate lives as though the intervening years had been a clerical error. This absence of drama is itself revealing. Miranda Quarry was the only one of his 4 wives who did not emerge from the marriage with a story to tell, and the most likely explanation is not that nothing happened, but that what happened was so uniformly bleak, so devoid of the peaks and valleys that characterize even the most dysfunctional relationships, that there was simply nothing to report. Not cruelty, not passion, not the wild oscillation between adoration and destruction that had defined his marriages to Britt and to Lynn. Just emptiness, a sustained, unbroken 4-year emptiness, as though the marriage had been a room that neither party had bothered to furnish, and in which both had sat, separately and in silence, waiting for something to begin that never did. Lynn Frederick, the fourth and final wife, inherited the estate and married David Frost in 1981, less than a year after Sellers' death, a velocity of romantic transition that recalled, with uncomfortable precision, the speed at which Sellers himself had moved from one relationship to the next. Whether this was coincidence, pragmatism, or some subtler form of identification with the dead husband, whose patterns she was unconsciously replicating, is a question that cannot be answered and need not be. The marriage to Frost lasted barely 12 months before ending in divorce, adding another layer to a biographical pattern that was beginning to look less like a series of individual choices and more like a contagion, as though proximity to Peter Sellers had infected those around him with his own inability to sustain a human connection, and the infection persisted long after the source had been removed. She subsequently managed the Sellers estate with a commercial efficiency that his children regarded as predatory and his friends regarded as inevitable. She sold rights. She licensed properties. She defended the estate's interests in court with the tenacity of a woman who understood, with absolute clarity, that the money was the only tangible product the marriage had yielded, and who was determined to preserve it. Whether she loved Peter Sellers, whether the marriage had contained, somewhere beneath the volatility and the mutual recrimination, a genuine emotional connection, is a question that her subsequent behavior does not answer. She managed his legacy. She protected his intellectual property. She ensured that the revenue continued to flow. These are the actions of a businesswoman, and they tell us nothing about the interior life of a wife. The estate continued to generate income long after both Sellers and Frederick were dead. Revenue from the Pink Panther franchise, which had become, over the decades, one of the most valuable comedy properties in cinema history, flowed into accounts and trusts and corporate entities with the reliable persistence of a river that has carved its channel too deeply to be diverted. Revenue from Casino Royale, from Dr. Strangelove, from the vast and seemingly inexhaustible catalogue of work he had left behind, added to the total. By some estimates, the cumulative value of the Sellers estate exceeded £100 million by the early 2010s, a figure so large that it had ceased to bear any meaningful relationship to the man who had earned it, the man who had lived in rented houses and hotel suites, who had bought and sold Rolls-Royces with the compulsive frequency of a collector who did not understand the difference between acquisition and satisfaction, and who had died owing debts that his estate was forced to settle before the serious business of accumulation could begin. The money flowed. It flowed into the accounts of Lynn Frederick until her death, and then into the accounts of her successors, and then into the accounts of their successors. A cascade of inheritance that grew more impersonal with each transfer, until the connection between the money and the man who had earned it was purely documentary, purely legal, purely abstract. Somewhere in a filing cabinet or a digital archive, there existed contracts bearing Peter Sellers' signature, and those contracts generated revenue, and the revenue was distributed according to legal instruments that bore no relationship to love or loyalty or the messy, irreducible complexity of human connection. The man was gone. The money remained. And the disparity between the two facts, between the transience of a human life and the permanence of a revenue stream, was, perhaps, the final absurdity in a life that had been characterized by absurdity from beginning to end. Lynn Frederick died on the 27th of April, 1994, at the age of 39. The cause was recorded as a combination of alcohol and medication. The official verdict was accidental death, though the boundary between accident and intention is, in such cases, difficult to establish with certainty, and the coroner's verdict, while legally definitive, was not emotionally satisfying to those who knew her circumstances. She had outlived her former husband by 14 years. She had inherited his fortune. She had not, by any available account, inherited anything resembling peace. She had married again and divorced again. She had fought legal battles over the estate. She had been vilified by his children and mistrusted by his friends. She had lived, for 14 years, as the custodian of a dead man's legacy, a position that conferred wealth and power, but not, apparently, the kind of meaning that makes wealth and power worth having. She was buried, and the money continued to accumulate in accounts that bore her name, and then, after her death, other names that had no connection to Peter Sellers at all, names that belonged to people who had never met him, never loved him, never been damaged by him, and who regarded his estate simply as a revenue stream, which is perhaps the most honest and the least sentimental way to regard the legacy of a man who spent his life pretending to be other people. Spike Milligan, the truest and most durable of his friends, the man who had known him since the late 1940s, who had created the Goon Show with him, who had watched him marry and divorce and marry and divorce and marry and divorce and marry, who had sent the telegram that read, "Congratulations. Who is she?" and who had described the final marriage as resting on foundations that would not support a garden shed, survived until the 27th of February, 2002. He was 83 years old. He had outlived Peter Sellers by nearly 22 years, and in those years he had continued to work, to perform, to write, and to struggle with the manic depression that had shadowed him for his entire adult life. Milligan's relationship with mental illness was fundamentally different from Sellers' relationship with his own psychological difficulties, and the difference is instructive. Milligan acknowledged his illness. He spoke about it publicly, at a time when public discussion of mental health was neither common nor encouraged. He submitted to treatment. He accepted hospitalizations. He took medication, though he complained about its effects on his creativity with the characteristic vehemence of a man who regarded bureaucratic interference in any form as a personal affront. He did not pretend to be well when he was not. He did not construct an elaborate public persona designed to conceal the chaos within. He simply said, "I am ill. I have always been ill. The illness is part of me. It is not all of me, but it is part of me, and I will not pretend otherwise." Sellers never managed this. Sellers could not say, "I am ill," because saying so would have required a stable I from which to make the declaration, and the stable I was precisely what he lacked. Milligan's illness was a condition, something he had, something that afflicted a person who existed independently of the affliction. Sellers' difficulty was more fundamental. It was not a condition that afflicted a person. It was the absence of a person, the vacancy at the center where a self should have been. You cannot treat a vacancy. You cannot medicate an absence. You can only watch as the absence consumes everything around it, drawing relationships and careers and marriages into itself like a black hole from which no light escapes. Milligan's epitaph, inscribed on his headstone in the churchyard of St. Thomas the Martyr in Winchelsea, East Sussex, reads, Duart me leet go rabe me brioit. It is written in Irish Gaelic. Translated, it means, I told you I was ill. The inscription exists in Gaelic rather than English because the Diocese of Chichester, displaying the institutional humorlessness that Milligan had spent his entire career opposing, refused to permit a joke on a gravestone in the language of the Church of England. It was undignified, they said. It was inappropriate. It failed to observe the proper solemnity of a Christian burial. Milligan's family, displaying the same cheerful, anarchic defiance of bureaucratic authority that had characterized every episode of the Goon show ever broadcast, simply switched languages. The joke survived. The bureaucrats were outmaneuvered. And the dead man, who had spent 70 years fighting institutions that lacked a sense of humor, won his last battle from beneath 6 feet of Sussex clay. It was, in its way, the perfect counterpoint to the funeral of Peter Sellers. Milligan's epitaph was honest, brutally, comically, heartbreakingly honest. It said exactly what it meant. There was no mask, no misdirection, no hidden meaning, no performance. I told you I was ill is the statement of a man who knows precisely who he is, knows precisely what ails him, and has decided that the most dignified response to both knowledge and ailment is a joke, a real joke, an honest joke, a joke that derives its power not from concealment but from revelation. It is the opposite of a disguise. It is the removal of every disguise. It is a man standing in his own grave and saying, "This is what I was. This is what killed me." And I will face it with laughter, because laughter is the only weapon I have ever trusted, and I will not put it down now. Sellers' funeral music, by contrast, was a lie, a deliberate, calculated, exquisitely crafted lie, constructed with the same attention to detail and the same instinct for misdirection that had characterized every performance of his career. He chose a song he hated. He chose it because it was the wrong song, because it would confuse the mourners, because it would force them to wonder what he had meant, because the wondering itself was the performance. Even in death, especially in death, the instinct to perform, to deceive, to be anyone other than himself, was stronger than the instinct to tell the truth. The two friends, united in life by their shared gift for making people laugh, were divided in death by their opposite relationships to authenticity. Milligan knew who he was and said so. Sellers did not know who he was and never stopped pretending. And the epitaphs, one honest, one false, stand as monuments to two fundamentally different ways of being a comedian, and perhaps two fundamentally different ways of being a human being. Graham Stark, who had known Sellers longer than almost anyone, and who had served as both witness and confessor to his friend's slow, spectacular disintegration, lived until the 21st of October, 2013. He was 91 years old, a considerable age, made more considerable by the fact that he had spent much of his adult life in the company of people who seemed determined to die young. Sellers had died at 54. Milligan had lasted to 83, but had been ill for decades. The world of post-war British comedy, which had seemed so vibrant and so permanent in the 1950s, had been steadily depleted by time and mortality, and Stark had watched it happen, had attended the funerals and read the obituaries and felt, with each successive loss, the thinning of the ranks. In his final years, he published additional memoirs and gave interviews in which he reflected on the man he had known since the early days of the Goon Show, more than half a century of friendship, a span that encompassed 4 marriages, at least 8 cardiac arrests, dozens of films, hundreds of arguments, thousands of telephone calls, and an incalculable number of shared silences. His accounts were marked by a kind of weary, indestructible affection, the perspective of someone who had loved a friend deeply, while never quite forgiving him for the damage he caused, and who had long since abandoned the hope that love and forgiveness might arrive at the same destination. He described Sellers without illusions, but also without contempt, without the score-settling bitterness that characterized some accounts, and without the hagiographic reverence that characterized others. He simply told the truth, as far as the truth was available to him, and the truth was complicated, and the complications were the whole point. "He was the funniest man I ever knew," Stark said in one of his last interviews, conducted when he was well into his 80s and had outlived most of the people about whom he was being asked. "He was also the most frightening, and the saddest. And if you ask me to explain how those 3 things could exist in the same person, I would tell you that I spent 50 years trying to work that out, and I never managed it. Some people are just beyond explanation. Peter was beyond explanation. He was beyond everything." Which brings us, at last and irrevocably, to the question that has haunted every page of this account, the question that has lurked beneath every marriage, every cardiac arrest, every character he inhabited and abandoned, every room he entered and emptied with the force of his personality. Who was Peter Sellers? He himself provided the most frequently quoted answer. In interviews conducted at various points throughout his career, he returned to the same confession with the regularity of a man circling a drain. "If you ask me to play myself, I will not know what to do. I do not know who or what I am." On another occasion, "There is no me. I do not exist. There used to be a me, but I had it surgically removed." These statements have been analyzed, interpreted, and diagnosed by professionals and amateurs alike for more than 4 decades. The interpretations fall, broadly, into 3 categories. None of them is entirely satisfactory. All of them contain a portion of the truth, and the truth itself, if it exists at all, is probably larger than any single interpretation can accommodate. The first interpretation is clinical. The biographers Roger Lewis and Ed Sikov, approaching from different methodological angles, but arriving at strikingly compatible conclusions, suggest that Sellers exhibited characteristics consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, possibly compounded by borderline features. The clinical profile of such a condition includes an unstable sense of self, intense and volatile interpersonal relationships, a paralyzing terror of abandonment that manifests as controlling behavior, and a tendency to oscillate between idealization and devaluation of the people closest to the sufferer. The diagnosis fits. It fits with a precision that is almost uncomfortable. It fits the 4 marriages, each of which began with an explosion of idealization so intense that it burned through ordinary caution in a matter of days, and ended with an implosion of contempt so complete that the other person was not merely rejected, but annihilated. It fits the disowned children, who were loved with absolute, suffocating intensity until they failed to meet an impossible standard, and were then rejected with equal intensity, as though love were a binary state, on or off, 1 or 0, with no gradations in between. It fits the obsessive need for professional approval, followed by the compulsive destruction of every professional relationship that provided it. And it fits the empty center, the void where an identity should have been, the hollow space that all the characters and all the wives and all the possessions and all the cardiac arrests could not fill. The second interpretation is professional. Shirley MacLaine, Hal Ashby, and others who worked with Sellers at his best, who saw him not as a patient or a husband or a father, but as an artist, which was the only context in which he functioned with anything approaching consistency, suggested that his absent identity was not a pathology, but a tool. The very quality that made his personal life a catastrophe was the quality that made his professional life transcendent. An actor with a strong sense of self brings that self to every role, and the audience sees it, however skillfully it is disguised. Olivia was always Olivia. Guinness was always Guinness. The performance might be brilliant, but the man behind it was always present, like a watermark in expensive paper, invisible at first glance but detectable by anyone who looked closely enough. Sellers had no watermark. He was a vessel, empty and waiting to be filled, and when the vessel was filled with a character, with Clouseau, with Strangelove, with chance, the result was not impersonation but transformation, not the simulation of another person, but the actual, temporary replacement of one consciousness with another. The gift and the affliction were inseparable. To cure the emptiness would have been to destroy the talent. To preserve the talent was to perpetuate the emptiness. There was no resolution. There was only the work. The third interpretation is biographical, and it is the simplest and the most human. Graham Stark traced the emptiness back to its source, and the source was Peg. She had loved him so completely, so possessively, and so early that she had occupied the space where a self should have formed. She had filled him with her own ambitions, her own identity, her own desperate need for applause and recognition, and had left no room, literally no room, not an inch of psychological space, for anything that was authentically his. The self was not missing. It was buried, interred beneath decades of maternal occupation, like an archaeological site that has been built over so many times that the original foundations are no longer accessible. And the weight of everything Peg had placed on top of it, the name of a dead brother, the backstage childhood, the intercepted letters, the managed friendships, the telephone calls that continued into his 40s and 50s, was too great for him to excavate, even if he had known it was there, even if he had possessed the tools, even if he had wanted to try, which he may not have. Because excavation would have meant confronting what was underneath, and what was underneath might have been nothing at all, and nothing at all was the one possibility he could not face. The influence of Peter Sellers on cinema is not always visible, because the greatest influences rarely announce themselves. They work beneath the surface, quietly, establishing new defaults, expanding the boundaries of what is considered possible, creating space for artists who may never know whose footsteps they are following. Before Sellers, the complete disappearance of an actor into a role was regarded as a theoretical possibility, an ideal discussed in acting schools and rehearsal rooms, but rarely achieved on screen. After Sellers, It became an aspiration. It became a measure of seriousness. It became, for some actors, an obsession that consumed their careers and, in some cases, their health. Daniel Day-Lewis, who retired from acting in 2017 after a career that many critics regarded as the finest of his generation, pursued total immersion with a dedication that bordered on self-destruction. He remained in character between takes. He refused to answer to his own name during production. He insisted on being addressed as Lincoln, as Plainview, as Christy Brown, even in the canteen, even in the car park, even in conversations that had nothing to do with the film. This commitment was Sellers' inheritance, transmitted across decades, though Day-Lewis would probably not describe it in those terms. What Sellers had achieved through the accident of his psychology, the complete erasure of the self in service of the character, Day-Lewis achieved through the application of ferocious discipline, and the distinction between the two methods is less important than the shared destination. And then there is Robin Williams. The parallel demands acknowledgement, because to ignore it would be to miss a pattern that extends beyond any single life and into the territory of something more general, more structural, more troubling. Williams was another comedian of extraordinary range and protean talent, another man who could become anyone, who could shift between characters with a speed and fluency that left audiences gasping, who could be hilarious and heartbreaking in the same sentence, sometimes in the same word. He was also another man who masked a profound interior darkness with an exterior of manic energy and relentless humor, as though the humor were a wall and the darkness were the thing on the other side of it, pressing against the bricks, testing the mortar, waiting for the first crack through which it could pour. Williams took his own life on the 11th of August, 2014. He was 63 years old. A subsequent autopsy revealed that he had been suffering from Lewy body dementia, a progressive neurological condition that was eroding his cognitive function, his sense of self, and his ability to do the one thing that had defined him since childhood: perform. The diagnosis, made posthumously, provided a medical explanation for his final despair. But the medical explanation, while necessary and important, does not account for everything. It does not account for the decades of depression that preceded the dementia. It does not account for the substance abuse that had punctuated his career. It does not account for the fundamental, structural similarity between his situation and Peter Sellers, two men who made the world laugh, who could not make themselves happy, and whose deaths revealed a chasm between the public persona and the private, suffering that the public had never been invited to see. Comedy, it appears, is not a cure for despair. It is, at best, a magnificent and temporary disguise, a way of holding the darkness at arm's length for as long as the performance lasts, and not 1 second longer. The lights go down, the audience leaves, the laughter fades, and the comedian is alone with whatever was there before the laughter started, which is often the very thing the laughter was designed to obscure. The last scene of Being There shows Chance the gardener walking across the surface of a lake. He does not sink. He does not struggle. He does not pause or hesitate or look down at his feet in surprise. He simply walks, calmly and without apparent effort, across water that should not support him. The camera holds. No explanation is offered. No miracle is announced. No other character witnesses the event. It happens in solitude, observed only by the audience, And then the film ends, and the screen goes dark, and the viewer is left to decide what they have seen. If you are no one, if there is truly nothing inside you, no weight, no substance, no self, then you cannot sink. You pass over the surface of the world without disturbing it, and the world, in turn, cannot disturb you. You are free from friction, from consequence, from the heavy, inescapable drag of being someone specific in a world that demands specificity. You can walk on water. You can make millions laugh. You can marry 4 women and father 3 children and leave them all behind. You can die and come back and die again. And none of it touches you, because there is no you to be touched.